All right, so we're reviewing the fee.org homeworks, and people were interested in. So right now we're undergoing and have been since 2009, 2010, unprecedented levels of state intervention. Unprecedented levels of state intervention. Never let a good crisis go to waste. The state is always looking for a way to grow its power. The United States has chosen to wear a mask, wear 2 masks, social distance policy directed from above. Sweden does a empower from below. No state requirements and individual responsibility without the massive interventions. So 3 forms of Keynesian intervention, Keynesian ideal type, where the economy is guided by experts, where you're in the short term. You're Keynesian economists, you're always in the short term. Keynesian thinking, worldview, politicians, always in the short term and needed to be guided by experts. But in the Hayekian ideal type, it's all about entrepreneurial awareness, out in immediate awareness, but thinking out into the long term, looking at investments out into the long term by entrepreneurs, not short-term economy guided by experts. So what was interesting about this New York Fed report that New York Federal Reserve report that's interesting is that up until this report, the Federal Reserve official bodies didn't acknowledge that expansionary monetary policy had any effect or any great effect on anything except the flow variables. So this national income equation of GDP is based on flow variables, expenditures on these categories over a given year. And then you can use expansionary and monetary and fiscal policy to then tweak or guide GDP in order for job creations. And that's flow variables. But what's unique about this Fed report now is that they're acknowledging that expansionary monetary policy, or easy money, also has effects on asset variables, meaning stock markets, art markets, and real estate markets, not just flow variables affecting GDP, but asset variables affecting the stages of production, as we looked at in the Hayekian explanation for the business cycle. So it's unique and good to see that the Fed is now acknowledging that monetary policy affects more than just flow variables, but it also affects asset variables. And what's also good to see in that report is that the Fed acknowledges that their interventions have differing effects on differing classes of people. So what this report acknowledges is that, especially now, we have a big case of what's called regime uncertainty, meaning that the long-term entrepreneurial prospects aren't so good. And the reason for that is because the investment environment isn't plain to see, right? The current president does how many executive orders within the first 2 weeks of being in office. All of that rule of law changes creates an unsound investment environment over the long term. So what that means is that the easy money, and we've learned that the Fed has kept the interest rate below the natural rate of interest for the last 10 or 12 years. And as we've discussed, that's why you're getting, even though the prospects for the economy in terms of regime uncertainty are very low due to all the mandates and rule of law changes and economy lockdown, that you're getting stock market booms. Even though was a small adjustment last week, it's still up 20% over the last 3 months. So the easy money is not able to channel itself into flow variables affecting investment because of the bad investment climate. So the easy money is channeling itself into flow variables, into asset variables, like the stock market, in the real estate market, and the art market. The real estate's booming everywhere except in New York City. Right. As people, as the wealthy leave New York City due to all the mandates, projected tax increases, a city which can't live within its means and balance its budgets, and is very overtly anti-business. So it's nice to see that the Fed is acknowledging that the easy money does not just affect Keynesian variables, but actually asset variables. And so what the report acknowledges is that instead of job creation, what happens with the easy money as it flows into asset variables, it exacerbates inequality. Now, there's two ways of looking at equality or equity. One is you have a quality of process, then the results are fair. But under current democratic dogmatism, people are talking about equality of results. Right now, this assumes everybody wants to create wealth and live in a huge house and drive Jaguars. So you're immediately creating a materialistic view of the world where equality or equity is quality of results. But we already know from the New York Times that you don't have a quality of process because of the rent seeking. Certain industry groups are protected from competition. So instead of addressing occupational licensing and oligopoly behavior and allowing equality of process, that's Mises' law. One intervention leads to another. So this inequality of process now means that you have to intervene to have an equality of results. And so it's nice to see that the Fed acknowledges that their monetary easing, in fact, does not create equality of results, but it exacerbates inequality. And the reason for that is because easy money and asset increases, those with more disposable income, or we're calling the rich, are more able to invest in the stock market, the art market, and the real estate market. For those with less disposable income, or those we're calling the poor, the easy money means that their purchasing power goes down. Less disposable income, you have to pay more for things than you would had you not intervened. So there's a new, in science, there's often things called being in the air. So for the last 4 or 5 years, there's been this concept of econogenics, where the first thing is we should look at what are the distributional effects, or what are the effects of interventions, who's affected, which types of classes of people are affected. So you can see that from the Fed report that they say, yes, there may be some positive GDP and paternalistic job creation under the easy money, but due to the regime uncertainty, asset bubbles are greater than paternalistic job creation, and only the more wealthy can afford to invest in asset markets. So monetary policy is regressive. And we'll be looking at that. Regressive meaning it helps those who are better off and hurts those who are worse off. So we'll be looking at that in more detail. So then that relates to the debt buildup that people are also interested in. So the state always spends more than it taxes because nobody wants to pay taxes, and people like to be the beneficiary of government expenditures. So by definition, when the state spends more than it taxes, it builds up debt. It builds up every year. When you run it, you don't make ends meet. That's called a deficit. And then at the federal level, when municipalities or states or at the federal level borrow, they create debt instruments known as bonds. So then you can look at a debt to GDP ratio. Debt to GDP. When the euro, European Union common currency, was first being introduced, in order to be accepted into that euro zone, your debt to GDP ratio had to be less than or equal to 60%. Right? But there was no mechanism to enforce that. So people, you have the core EU countries, the Netherlands, France, and Germany, who tend to live within their means and balance their budgets, but the periphery countries, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, tend not to balance their budgets. So these countries then don't have an incentive. It's called free riding. The periphery countries are free riding on the fiscal conservatism of the core countries. So right after the EU is put in place, the periphery countries run up their debt to GDP ratio because there's no reason not to. So in the United States right now, GDP is about 22 trillion, and our debt has increased 4 trillion over the last year. So the debt's about 27 trillion. Well, what's that? Approximately 110%. So you'll see that the United States would not even be let into the common euro union. So, which is not a problem, because now there's been a recent change. So on the one hand, the good news is that the Fed is now acknowledging that monetary policy can be regressive. But on the other hand, now people are re-envisioning what good fiscal policy is. So it used to be, call this the old. It used to be that as long as your national income was growing at a faster rate than your debt was growing, then that was sustainable fiscal policy. So if the economy is growing at 3% and your debt's growing at 2%, well, then you have a sustainable fiscal policy, ignoring the fact that a lot of the bonds, the debt, are purchased by the Fed itself, ignoring that tie between the two, monetary and fiscal policy, and the regressiveness of monetary policy. But ever since the 2008, 2009 bailouts, Great Recession, the real income has been growing at 2%, and the debt has been growing at 3%. So by definition, under the old fiscal rules, the United States I'm talking about, fiscal policy is no longer sustainable. But luckily, we have a new establishment or mainstream idea of fiscal policy. And this is in the Economist magazine, February 13th to the 19th, to where they're saying, and of course, the way journalism works is you in order to get access to the news items, to government press officers, you need to espouse what the state is doing and back it up. So the Economist is very much a Keynesian publication. In other words, a publication that wants to be close to the source of power, right? Like America as the world's policeman, and anything that the state officials determine should be done is then written about as it should be. It's called the Whig theory of history, as the Voltaire, we live in the best possible worlds. So what the new fiscal normal is, luckily for those in power, and you constantly get a turnover of people who work for the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and they then become Treasury officials and central bank officials. So you get this constant turnover between power within the mainstream economics profession. So and the whole reason that the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the World Trade Organization were created after World War II is to allow the institutionalization of mainstream economics and the ability for countries to use monetary and fiscal policy, not balance their budgets and print money. That was the whole idea of establishing the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO underneath Bretton Woods, which are part of the United Nations. So under the new fiscal normal, as long as the increase in national income is greater than the state bond borrowing rates, then you have sustainable fiscal policy. So if an economy is growing at 2.5%, and due to all the easy money, central banks keeping interest rates below the natural rate of interest, creating asset bubbles, they're borrowing at 1.5%, and if the economy is, let's just say, growing at 2%, then it's considered sustainable. So you'll see that there's been a big shift in orthodox thinking about what is sustainable fiscal policy. As long as you have easy money on the monetary policy, well, then fiscal policy is sustainable. Yet we know that monetary policy is regressive. And of course, the debt gets past the bonds, the debt gets passed on to those yet voting. So how is that equitable or fair? I'm not exactly sure. So this idea that easy money leads to asset bubbles, that's called the Cantium Effects. So we're going to look at, and we'll be studying later in monetary theory exactly what Cantium effects are, but let's take a look at what that is right now. Okay, this is from my book, Economics for Everyone, which is available for free on my website. And I've been working with an econometrician on this idea. So if you look at, here's the, from 1987 to January 2010. So you have the original .com, and this right here is the housing index, and this is the money supply. So you'll see that during the original .com boom and bust, the Fed starts doing easy money. And then you'll see that the housing prices follow that easy money. So that's the easy money creating an asset bubble. In this case, the housing index. Just like today, you're having easy money creating a stock market bubble and a real estate bubble. I haven't been following the art market that much. So then the Fed starts tapering off the easy money. So now these long-term investments, in this case housing, no longer seem as affordable. And the thing that triggers the crash is that Fannie Mae is the United States government-sponsored enterprise which guarantees the mortgage-backed bonds. And we'll be looking at the mortgage-backed bonds in this situation more in detail later. So there's only one firm besides Chinese companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange which didn't have a clean audit. And that's the government-sponsored enterprise which guaranteed the housing mortgages. So when that becomes declared unauditable, you get a housing crash. And so, of course, then during the Great Recession, the Fed starts doing easy money again. But you'll see that housing doesn't recover. And that's because there was many government policies put in place for people to hold on to their homes, right? The moral hazard. And so this separation between monetary policy and the real economy, that's an example of regime uncertainty. So that's what I wanted to say about that, the relationship between monetary policy, fiscal policy, the new normal under monetary and fiscal policy, econogenics, and people are realizing the regressive nature of interventions in monetary policy. Any questions or comments? Overseas? Got somebody trying to, any questions or comments on that?